Sponsored by NordVPN. What is real horror? Now, I know that seems like a pretentious question, especially seeing as I'm a history channel and not a movie review channel. But it's a question I think that's worth asking at least, and I promise you I have a point, a historical point. When you go to see a horror movie, you are purposefully indulging in the experience of a negative emotion. It's a form of psychological masochism that triggers a rush of fight or flight adrenaline or stimulates the intellect by giving the audience a heightened sense of comprehension, a higher state of being in a way, in the face of brutal, uncompromising trauma, forcing the viewer to rationalize and analyze something truly impossible, or rather, something unthinkable. An experience so terrible, it instills fear and dread, while also allowing the viewer to fantasize about what they would do in such a situation. The zombie genre is the most popular of this type for obvious reasons, because it opens up not just the supernatural and cerebral horror akin to The Conjuring or The Exorcist, the stuff that gets inside your head and just raw terrorizes you, but the existential dread of the apocalypse as well. What happens when civilization breaks down and society is forever changed by a force no one can stop? Yet, when that society breaks down, all the rules, limitations, and boundaries, all the restrictions, the chafing, suffocating restrictions set by civilization are lifted, allowing the audience to speculate how they would survive, what they would do, and how would they cope with this changed situation. Indeed, that fantasy aspect of horror fiction where human beings are pushed to the razor's edge allow for all kinds of gratification, from sexual deviancy to atrocious violence. We watch horror to get that escape, to indulge in those darker fantasies. But there is a fatal flaw, if you'll excuse the turn of phrase, in most horror films. One that undermines their goal, or rather lessens their significance. And that is the same fantasy that provides its entertainment. While our darkest superstitions and fears fill us with terror at the thought of a demon possessing a doll to murder us, or our experiences through the pandemic show that if a zombie virus were to actually break out, all our confidence that society could handle it easily has been shattered. For those of us who've read World War Z, the pandemic was a particularly vindicating experience. Also, side note, we need to retcon that Brad Pitt monstrosity and get a Netflix Love, Death and Robot style miniseries made with all the various chapters getting an episode. Could you imagine, like, the Battle of Yonkers, Radio Free Earth? It'd be amazing. Anyway, yes, the thing that ruins horror movies, as well as other genres of indulgent fantasy film, like the Fast movies or Die Hard and other such things like that, John Wick, is that we are safe in the knowledge that these things, by the laws of science, nature, and man, are impossible. They can't happen. There is no mercenary organization using Dodge Vipers to rob banks. There isn't a secret society of assassins staying at the Continental hotels. There's no secret cabal of vampires, demons possessing dolls, zombie hordes marching to consume us, and though aliens are almost certainly real, their ability to reach us across the void of space violates almost all the known laws of physics, and so the likelihood of them invading us is remote. Thus, there is always a disconnect between the fear and introspection horror films make us feel, and our very, very real everyday lives. So, some directors took the logical step to make a more grounded version of the story, more grounded science fiction thrillers and horror films based on real-life hypotheticals. 28 Days Later, for example, one of my favourites, even though it terrifies me, showed us a more realistic take on the zombie genre, where a virus similar to rabies spreads rapidly, destroying the UK in its entirety. Contagion, another virus film, was far ahead of its time. While our own plague didn't reach the level of lethality as the disease depicted in the film, the various aspects of the world's response, the panic, the breakdown of government, anti-vaxxers and Alex Jones types, and false cure proponents, it all felt very, very real, and as I said, was way ahead of its time, and it turned out to be completely correct in its assessment of us and society. But the most famous realist horror film is the 1980s film made by the BBC, based on a realistic depiction of nuclear war and its aftermath. That film's name was Threads. It's one of my favourite films and is genuinely one of the most horrifying things I've ever watched. The bleak despair and unflinching depiction of reality is gut-wrenching, as radiation, nuclear winter, and the collapse of civilization destroys not only the characters on screen, but also our dreams for Mad Max or Fallout. There is no escape, no hope, just the end of all we hold dear. There is a really good review of Threads on YouTube, which goes into more detail, and it actually inspired me to make this video, and you should definitely go watch it. But sadly, that author's video title is incorrect. Because, as you can see, given the title of my video, I'm suggesting that I know a film that's scarier. And here is where my very confused regular audience and the thumbnail start to make sense. Because I run a history channel, not a film or pop culture channel. And my problem with Threads, Contagion, and other science fiction horror films is that while far scarier than the horror movies of fantasy, they are still based in hypotheticals. It's a film about what could happen, and while that's terrifying, it's more a study of the externalized horrors of society and humanity at large, rather than the individual, leaving the audience traumatized yet still abstract from the events on screen, something those of us who have been watching war on the nightly news and here on YouTube, and even me reporting it, are familiar with. Even though you may have a few nightmares or find sleeping with the light on a good idea, as a guy with a videographic memory I can relate, at the end of the day, you aren't really forced inward by these films. You may get jump scares, you may get creeped out, you may get big philosophical twists like The Sixth Sense or Inception or War of the Worlds, one of my favourites there. But generally speaking, your very perception of the world and yourself remains unchanged or perhaps only lightly damaged. Even with the masterpiece that is Threads, you always knew nuclear war was horrifying. That's not a dramatic revelation. And while giving it form may have affected you, the analysis of the world or yourself doesn't really change. Which is where my selection for the scariest film of all time comes in. It was this film, more than any other film, that chilled me to my core. It horrified me in ways I really couldn't fathom. Not because of what I saw on screen, but rather the implications of the events depicted and the way they were depicted. The film turns a lens on the darkest subject mankind has ever known. It does it in a so matter-of-fact way while pulling no punches at all, but most frightening is the way it's written, the way it's performed, the way it's filmed. It holds up a mirror to the audience, revealing that the evil and horror oozing out of the screen is not some supernatural monster, not some devil, not some unknown force. The evil depicted on screen could very easily be you. And unlike all the other films I've mentioned, this film is a historical film. The events of this film actually happened. I present to you Conspiracy.
Das Volk kann Ihnen ja nicht nachfolgen. Das Volk ist ja gekettet an seinen Boden, ist ja gekettet an seine Heimat.
Berlin, 31. Juli 1941. Der Reichsmarschall des Großdeutschen Reiches, Beauftragter für den Vierjahresplan, Vorsitzender des Ministerrats für die Reichsverteidigung, an den Chef der Sicherheitspolizei und des SD, SS-Gruppenführer Heydrich, Berlin. In Ergänzung der Ihnen bereits mit Erlass vom 24. Januar 1939 übertragenen Aufgabe, die Judenfrage in Form der Auswanderung oder Evakuierung einer den Zeitverhältnissen entsprechend möglichst günstigsten Lösung zuzuführen, beauftrage ich Sie hiermit, alle erforderlichen Vorbereitungen in organisatorischer, sachlicher und materieller Hinsicht zu treffen für eine Gesamtlösung der Judenfrage im deutschen Einflussgebiet in Europa. Sofern hierbei die Zuständigkeiten anderer Zentralinstanzen berührt werden, sind diese zu beteiligen. Ich beauftrage Sie weiter, mir in Bälde einen Gesamtentwurf über die organisatorischen, sachlichen und materiellen Vorausmaßnahmen zur Durchführung der angestrebten Endlösung der Judenfrage vorzulegen. Gezeichnet Reichsmarschall Göring.
In January of 1942, the Greater German Reich spanned from the shores of France to central Russia, from the Norwegian fjords to the plains of North Africa. Yet the empire to last 1,000 years was teetering on the precipice of disaster. The United States of America, having been attacked by the Japanese, had now entered the war against them. Their advance on Moscow had been halted and subsequently thrown back by a ferocious winter counterattack that had very nearly caused a rout, which in the worst-case scenario could have destroyed half the Wehrmacht outright. And every evening, weather permitting, the men of RAF Bomber Command were slowly but steadily attacking their centres of industry, with ever-increasing effect. The Kingdom of Prussia, which later formed Germany, had always suffered from a terrible geopolitical position, being sandwiched between Europe's great powers while having practically no access to the sea, either by being landlocked or blockaded by the British Royal Navy. Germany is not resource-rich. Oil reserves in Central Europe are minuscule, food production was insufficient to cope with the level of urbanization, rare metals are called rare for a reason, and manpower, especially after a century of industrialized warfare on the continent, was a valuable and increasingly finite resource. Hitler and his generals knew full well that they needed to do two things. First, they needed to secure a reliable supply of these crucial resources, and second, they needed to optimize their current resource consumption. Failing to do these two things would result in their war effort grinding to a halt and eventually being hurled back by the combined might of what amounted to practically the entire world. And so, on the Eastern Front, a new offensive was being planned for the annexation of eastern Ukraine and the Caucasus region, codenamed Case Blue. This offensive was to seize the fertile farmlands and extensive oil fields of the southern Soviet Union, giving the Nazis the resources to defeat the Red Army and then turn the Wehrmacht westwards for a showdown with the Allies. But in the Berlin suburb of Wannsee, at a palatial villa overlooking a picturesque lakeside, a meeting was scheduled by Deputy Head of the SS, Reinhard Heydrich, to organize the other half of their plan: resource and production optimization. The war effort needed labor. Due to the differences between European rail gauges and the lack of developed infrastructure in the Soviet Union, the logistical network of the Eastern Front needed to be rebuilt from scratch, while heavy losses during Operation Barbarossa and the winter counterattack meant war material production needed to be increased dramatically. However, it was abundantly clear that Germany also needed to reduce resource consumption. Food, fuel, and general supplies were diminishing at a rapid pace, and maintaining the quality of life for Reich citizens while preventing the deprivation of World War I was a priority of the Nazi regime, as they knew full well what such deprivation could lead to, given how they had seized power. But it was with that power that they had seized, wielded by the party and the SS, that the leadership of the Reich found their answer. They realized they could kill not just 2, but 3 or 4 birds with a single stone. A solution to their labor shortage, a reduction in their food consumption, and a new source of supplies as well as financial capital, from assets to property to women's hair and gold teeth. A captive manpower pool from which they could draw test subjects for medical experiments, as well as chain gangs for road and rail construction, all while removing what the Third Reich considered as its most dangerous and ultimate enemy. At this beautiful country villa on a frosty winter morning was planned the greatest criminal conspiracy and the most horrific act of genocide in human history, as Reinhard Heydrich, Adolf Eichmann, and Heinrich Müller presented to a full government committee their plan for what would be known as the final solution to the Jewish question. Conspiracy is a dramatization of that meeting. Known to history as the Wannsee Conference, the script is derived from the only surviving copy of the minutes to this meeting, found in the archives of the Reich's Foreign Ministry by investigators working for the Nuremberg war crimes trials. The dialogue of the film is fictionalized for realism and dramatic effect, but it is nevertheless extrapolated from the actual record of the meeting, where the Holocaust was planned, defined, and ultimately agreed upon by the SS and civilian government of the Third Reich. The historians and researchers who worked on the film were absolutely relentless in pursuing authenticity and accuracy wherever possible. For example, as each of the characters is a real historical figure, each of them had their own psychological profile written up by specialists to aid the writers and the actors in their depiction. The film was shot on the actual location, so the actors could immerse themselves into their surroundings and experience the atmosphere in character. And their attention to detail is simply staggering. The uniforms and their decorations are immaculately accurate. Dialogue discussing events contemporary to the meeting, such as the recent Soviet counterattack and the death of Field Marshal von Reichenau. The lead researcher, Andrea Axelrod, went so far as to call the Berlin Meteorological Office to find out the exact weather on the date of the conference, that being January 20th, 1942, which is faithfully represented as a snowy day in the movie. Heydrich even arrives in a genuine rebuilt Fieseler Storch. This thing is beautiful. As an aviation lover, it's just a joy to see. Which the film uses to demonstrate that he flew himself to the meeting, showing the audience his credentials as a pilot. Even the cars that the other characters arrive in are accurate to their vehicles. Now, before I geek out too much, this isn't an episode of History Buffs. All credit to Nick, I don't want to tread on his turf too much. Though I may have a crack at some historical anime if there's a lot of demand for it. But suffice to say, in terms of accuracy, with the exception of one or two of the depictions of the characters which I'll get into later, the accuracy of this film is phenomenal. The advisory documents provided by the historical research team to the writers and the actors was in the hundreds of pages. As I said, each character got their own full psych profile, and almost all of that advice made it into the film in some shape or form. What I want to focus on in this film is why I find it so compelling, and why I class it as a kind of horror film. Though I will say, if you want to avoid spoilers and experience this film raw, it is a bit hard to find online depending where you live. Thankfully though, we have a sponsor today to help with that. This video has been generously sponsored by the world's fastest and most popular VPN service, NordVPN. In today's ever-changing technology landscape, a VPN is vital for staying safe online. You know what a VPN is, I know what a VPN is, and most of us have one. We use it to get around region blockers and access content normally unavailable, like the movie I'm reviewing today. We use it to keep our data safe from hackers, we use it to secure our IP, and rest assured, Nord does everything a good VPN should do, and it does it brilliantly. But what you might not know is, it does much more than that. Nord's Active Protection shields you from malware, trackers, and ads. The inbuilt dark web monitor notifies you if someone leaks your credentials. MeshNet allows you to connect up to 6 devices remotely and securely, and it comes with a dedicated IP that helps you avoid captchas and block lists. In my job here on YouTube, I have to delve into the sketchier parts of the internet to find information, everywhere from early internet archives to various unsavory Telegram channels. So Nord's security features are vital for me, and they are vital for you. But the best part is, they don't track your information or share it, and you are fully encrypted at all times with an emergency kill switch should things get out of control. They have 24/7 customer support, a dedicated app for every device, and right now, you can get 4 months extra on a 2-year plan by just clicking the link in the description below. After all, Nord has the 30-day money-back guarantee if you don't like it, so if you're in the market for a VPN, you have literally no reason not to give it a shot. So give them a shot. Click the link in the description below and get that special offer. Plus, you'll be helping the channel, and I'll appreciate it. Now, back to the video. Historical films always run the risk of turning into documentaries. And as someone who makes documentaries, there is a fine balance in making an informative film and making an entertaining one. I've always found that when discussing history, it is better to use a narrative format than it is to use raw data and spreadsheets. I can rattle off the timeline of events, who did what happened where, but unless there is a context to these events, unless there is a drama, a story, a grand operatic struggle between characters or ideologies, these events are utterly meaningless. As Alfred Hitchcock so eloquently put it, what is drama but life with the dull bits cut out? So should a historical film be. But therein lies the problem. To do a historical event justice, the dull bits must be left in so they contextualize the climax. If you've ever watched Oliver Stone's Alexander, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Sure, the film is very accurate in its technical details, but the actual dramatization itself is absolutely atrocious. When it's actually doing historical epic things, the movie is great. The sets are accurate, the costumes are magnificent, and I particularly enjoy the battle scenes. They're amazing, and the Battle of Gargamella is the most accurate depiction of a classical battle in the history of film. But when it gets to the characters and the dialogue, it's just completely and utterly woeful. You just pass out from sheer boredom. It's not a story, it's not even a biography, it's just a recount of events with no flair. From the outset then, Conspiracy seems to be doomed from the start. After all, it's simply a movie about a meeting. A meeting so infamous and horrific it turns the stomach, but a meeting nonetheless. It should be painfully boring, and if it had been told in a simple recount like the aforementioned Alexander, it would have been. In fact, we know this would be the case because a German remake of this film was made last year, known simply as The Conference, and this film was a bland, remarkably lifeless production, with both the writing and the casting decisions made for several of the major figures at the table being, quite frankly, completely wrong. Heydrich in particular. It was also rather lazily shot. Throughout the film, they constantly use these wide frames, getting most of the meeting table on the screen, but that has the effect of making it feel clinical, or, even the lighting, look at it, it feels sterile. It is far, far inferior to the original German language version of the film, Die Wannsee Conference, from 1984, which, while making a number of errors due to a lack of complete historiography which hadn't been completed yet in 1984, it follows the same minutes as Conspiracy, and as such it does a fantastic job at capturing the casual brutality of the SS and the Nazi regime. Though I feel, due to the sensibilities of the time, being more recent to the event and the tensions of the Cold War, it tends to fall into the trap of showing the participants as sort of slightly cartoonishly evil. That said, I have to give particular mention to the performance of Dietrich Mattausch. I'm sorry about that. I apologize if I've butchered that name. His performance as Heydrich was amazing, who he captured nearly perfectly. His performance was only exceeded by the lead actor of this film, Conspiracy. In fact, the casting for Conspiracy is so incredible for every character, I can't actually believe they managed to get so many high-class Shakespearean actors into one production, though it is made by HBO, so I guess that does help. Home box office, it's in the name. Man, they don't make movies like this anymore. HBO has switched over to all these TV series, and while Rome was excellent, and Game of Thrones, besides the ending, was rather good, there was something just so good about HBO in the 90s and early 2000s. Something really good. And a lot of it comes from their casting, and the leading man of this film is none other than Kenneth Branagh.
And gentlemen in England, now abed, shall think themselves accursed they were not here, and hold their manhoods cheap, whiles any speaks that thought with us upon St. Crispin's Day!
Famous for his role as Henry V, and more commonly, Gilderoy Lockhart from Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, although my audience would probably be more familiar with him from his role in Christopher Nolan's Dunkirk, playing William Tennant, or Commander Bolton, I think he was credited as in the film, who is a fictional character based on William Tennant. But anyway, he plays the leading role in this film. He plays head of the SS Sicherheitsdienst, Reinhard Heydrich. Now, when I first read this, I thought, he doesn't look much like Heydrich. And even with his incredible acting ability, I had my doubts about whether he could pull off such a heinously evil man. But as you can see with his grand entrance, something Heydrich was famous for, and is indeed remarked upon by the various attendees, all my doubts were crushed in an instant.
Colonel? I love this house. Seeing it from the air, you can appreciate the architecture. Are we ready?
Absolutely, sir.
And after the war, it will be my home. Marvellous home. So,
The makeup work is just astonishing. The piercing blue eyes and blonde hair, combined with the high collar of his SS uniform and Kenneth Branagh's rigid jawline, completely encapsulates Heydrich's aura, and when paired with his performance, demonstrates what I believe to be one of the best depictions of a historical figure in cinema. Which is a big claim, I know, but the combination of friendliness, charm, and dashing debonair gentleman matches what we know of Heydrich's personality. He was renowned for being highly cultured, as the son of an aristocrat who owned a conservatory, a classically trained musician in both violin and piano, a professionally trained military officer, both as a naval ensign and as a fighter pilot, having flown 100 combat missions in the Luftwaffe, which included an escape from behind enemy lines. A socialite of much repute, hosting some of the best parties in the Reich's inner circle, and a prodigious womanizer. In fact, the only stain on his immaculate career record occurred when he was forced to resign his naval commission due to an adultery scandal for conduct unbecoming an officer and a gentleman. But behind the facade of the rakish, charming war hero lies the monster who Hitler called the man with the iron heart. Heydrich's nickname was the Butcher of Prague, a title he earned while serving as Reichsprotektor of Bohemia and Moravia, where his reign of terror was as ruthless as it was efficient. Within a week of his arrival in Czechia, he had declared martial law, arrested 5,000 Czech citizens, with 500 of them being executed immediately, while the rest were sent to the camps where survival was calculated at around 5%. The depiction of him in Conspiracy shows that affable, charming exterior for exactly what it was: a mask. Throughout the film, his friendly and affable disposition is only barely veiling the pitiless, violent creature hiding beneath. Every time he talks, he smiles kindly. He encourages the participants to be frank and to engage in the conversation freely and honestly. He is the perfect host, ensuring everyone's voice will be heard. But the moment his opinions are disputed, the moment the authority of his agency, the SS, is challenged, his disposition switches instantly. The mask falls away, revealing his true self. A vicious snake, coiled around his prey, slowly strangling the resistance out of his victims, while ready to strike with deadly venom anyone who threatens to interrupt his meal. Every time this happens, a chill runs down my spine.
But our war is against the Jews. I do not see the logic.
We will not sterilize every Jew and wait for them to die. We will not sterilize every Jew and then exterminate the race. That's farcical. Dead men don't hump. Dead women don't get pregnant. Death is the most reliable form of sterilization. Put it that way.
But as with every story, where there is a villain, there is a loyal henchman. And in history, as in the film, we have just such a man. Adolf Eichmann. Famously defined by Hannah Arendt as the symbol of her theory, the banality of evil. Stanley Tucci is, quite frankly, terrifying in this role. Genuinely one of the scariest performances I have ever seen in any form of media, and one of Stanley Tucci's best performances as well. Like Heydrich, Eichmann radiates menace, but in a very different way. While Heydrich uses deceptive charm and harsh brutality and alternates between the two with that juxtaposition to achieve his aims, Eichmann is the constant, cold boot of the state on the back of your neck. He is just as ideologically committed as any SS man, a hate-filled anti-Semite to the core. But his smiles are not charming, they are wan, almost bemused smiles. His comments are either whimsical, sarcastic humour, or the cold, functional communication of an autocrat. There is no feeling and no passion in this man. He is simply a machine, a functionary. Every now and then he may emote, he may lose his temper, he may even venture an opinion, but he is a machine. A machine driven by ambition, ideology, and expediency. And, like with Heydrich, our very first impression of him is a masterclass in cinema.
Do we have enough? How many fell?
I am sure we have a sizable infantry, sir.
You are sure, or you know?
I know, sir.
Itemize the cost. He pays.
These two men form the primary catalyst of the film, as indeed they did in life. These two men, more than any other, are responsible for the evil we know came to pass. But as this work so brilliantly shows, the steps towards genocide, while ideologically uniform, are never as clear-cut as the media or even history books portray. Every branch of the Reich government has a seat at the table. Unlike with all authoritarian regimes, though especially Hitler's government, each branch is in a constant war for its own interests against everyone else. Hitler specifically designed his party and later his government this way, including the military. The SS versus the SA. The Army High Command versus the Armed Forces High Command. The SS versus the civilian government. And then, of course, he appointed dual department heads with overlapping responsibility. Hermann Goering against Martin Bormann, who was in turn feuding with Heinrich Himmler. And at this meeting, despite their universal dedication to the removal of Jews from Germany, there is an upcoming showdown about how it will be run and, more importantly, who will run it. And Heydrich is on his way to settle that matter, consolidating all power and authority into the SS once and for all. But first, he must contend with the Reich Chancellery and the Interior Ministry, represented by Dr. Kritzinger and Dr. Stuckart, with the latter being played by an immaculate Colin Firth. They represent the old guard of German society, traditional conservatives and bureaucrats inside the civil service who, while loyal members of the Nazi regime, are none too pleased at the radical changes being made by the SS. They are steadily becoming more and more worried as they can feel their grip on power slipping. Then, you have Supreme Court Judge and head of the Ministry of Justice, Roland Freisler, famous for his show trials, with loud screaming tirades berating the accused. A true believer in almost a religious sense, he represents the public face of the regime and its iron fist in dealing with dissent. A rabid anti-Semite and anti-communist, after spending time as a POW in Russia during World War I. He leads the more ideologically committed faction at the meeting. Seated alongside him is Karl Schöngarth, himself a former lawyer and chief of security for the occupation government in Krakow, Poland. He represents the casually brutal enforcers of the Third Reich. He is coarse, loud, and rather vulgar. In his role as SS Chief of Security in Poland, Schöngarth was the commander of the various Einsatzgruppen death squads who had carried out the second wave of what was known as the Holocaust of Bullets, though he himself was the head bureaucrat and as such only ordered the murders rather than commit them, a distinction not shared by Dr. Rudolf Lange, commander of Einsatzgruppen task forces in Latvia. He very much has carried out the executions personally, and the effects on him are apparent. While not filled with remorse or regret by any means, he has very evidently been affected by his role as he is the only one at the meeting to offer a practical viewpoint. He is distant, with a 1,000-yard stare. This interpretation of him is somewhat ahistorical, which some have criticized as sympathetic, but his depiction stands in for all the men who will ultimately carry out the final solution. Men traumatized and desensitized to such an extent, it renders them inhuman and thus capable of anything. Though his leader is utterly devoid of any conscience to lose. General of the Gestapo, Heinrich Müller. A stone-cold, relentless bureaucrat. Officious, cruel, and a similar creature to Eichmann, though far more malevolent and openly hostile. He doesn't veil his contempt of non-SS personnel, with the exception of Freisler, who, given Müller is a Gestapo chief, he considers the head of the Ministry of Justice a colleague. However, at this table, there is one man who the audience is supposed to detest the most, which is ironic given the subject matter. He is also perhaps the most controversial, as he differs considerably from his historical counterpart, although, as we've established, their characterizations here have been altered slightly to demonstrate the various wings of the regime. Dr. Klopfer is the official representative of Martin Bormann, and he is emblematic of the Nazi Party leadership. Whereas the rest of the cast hold an official position in government or the SS, and they are actually doing something beneficial to the state, grotesque though it may be, Gerhard Klopfer is a political animal. He speaks for the Nazi Party itself, and is, as Bormann's assistant, the chief political bureaucrat, setting appointments and meetings while arranging political favours for the various denizens of the Reich's upper echelon. His characterization seems to be more based on Martin Bormann himself than Gerhard Klopfer, but it achieves the desired effect. A man obsessed with his own self-importance, indulgent, arrogant, and dismissive of those he perceives below him, taking every opportunity to spread malicious rumours while belittling men of lower rank. He carries an air of superiority despite being by far the lowest calibre of man in the room. It doesn't matter the ideology, the culture, or the country, you will always find a party hack. And that leaves the remainder of the meeting's attendees, and they are bureaucrats from the various ministries involved. First is Erich Neumann, Hermann Göring's representative at the meeting and secretary in charge of industrial productivity under the Office of the Four-Year Plan. Next, there is Martin Luther, von Ribbentrop's deputy at the Foreign Office, responsible for administering the final solution throughout the occupied territories. Working alongside him was Otto Hoffmann, officer in the SS regarding issues of race and settlement, while Poland, the primary region where the Holocaust would take place, was overseen by Chief Secretary Bühler, his Chief Administrator Dr. Meyer, and his Undersecretary Georg Leibrandt. Each of them has their own objectives and motives in this conference based on their requirements. The Poland delegation are concerned about the overcrowding in the ghetto system and the speed in which the final solution can be carried out, relieving administrative and economic pressure on them in the process. The departments dealing with foreign affairs are concerned about how they will enforce these policies on the various Axis nations and collaboration governments, while also dealing with the demographic shifts that this process will cause. But the most pressing concern is that of Erich Neumann, who is most concerned about how the rail transport, equipment, logistical concerns, and the slaughter of potentially useful labourers will affect war production. And so, it is this cast of bureaucrats, politicians and civil servants, who will sit at this table and decide the fates of nearly 10 million people. A table filled mostly with lawyers and men with doctorates, intelligent, cultured, educated men from a country renowned as a beacon of civilization, of literature and art. And yet here these noble gentlemen sit to plan the most monstrously evil crime to ever be carried out by man. The industrialized, clinical, mechanical slaughter of an entire race along with their culture. And you, my dear viewer, get to watch it in real time. I do not wish to spoil the film for you, as the ultimate intent is for you to watch it, as much as a historical film can be spoiled at any rate, but I'll give you a rundown. The flow of the meeting is very normal. They mingle and mix with one another before they enter the meeting. You hear the office chatter, rumours of news about the war, discussions about the upcoming meeting, interdepartmental shade being thrown at the SS for taking all the power, while all the conservatives worry about the meeting's contents, as they considered the Jewish question already solved by them and their responsibility. These guys are trying to take their jobs. It's unacceptable. The personal dynamics and the factions of the meeting begin to form, only to be overshadowed by the arrival of Heydrich himself, his aura of menace and authority silencing any and all debate. Once they take their seats, they formally introduce everyone and establish the objective of their meeting, that being the document that you heard at the start of this video, outlining the requirement for the, quote, final solution to the Jewish question. The meeting follows the pace of a normal board meeting. Issues are raised and discussed, but what sets Conspiracy apart is that in the sections of the minutes where a break was specified, these breaks are left in the film, with interactions and dialogue off the record between the various members of the conference. As mentioned before, a full psych profile was done on each attendee, combined with a historical record of their role, as well as their actions prior and post the meeting at Wannsee. And while these dialogues are speculatory and not based in any concrete historical fact, they are nevertheless well-researched and authentic, which gives the film a great advantage in conveying the various characters seated at the table playing this most grotesque game. These extra interactions stop the men at the table from simply being evil Nazi bureaucrat number 42A. We've seen that stereotype in a million different movies. These men aren't a stereotype. They are real people, with jobs, expectations, interests. Conspiracy does something practically no piece of media has ever done. It tells the story of humanity's worst crime, the genocide of millions, the Holocaust, from the perspective of the perpetrators. Holocaust films have always been made to focus on the suffering of the victims, and rightfully so. The inhumanity, the ugliness, the horror of what was done. The most famous of these films, of course, is Schindler's List, and it is an absolute masterpiece for very good reason. Yet Conspiracy sits us down at the table responsible for all the horror we've come to know. Yet what strikes you is the inane mediocrity of it all. You expect, when you hear of a meeting of the top Nazis settling the final solution of the Jewish question, you expect the castle of doom at midnight during a thunderstorm. The background outside the meeting room window should be constantly punctuated with formations of SS stormtroopers marching past, with bands playing evil music. Yet, here we are. The boardroom at a villa. Granted, it's a very fancy boardroom, but a boardroom nonetheless. Aside from Heydrich, the people at this table are not Aryan supermen with chiseled jaws and angry scowls, planning the deaths of millions with glee, but office workers, civil servants, family men with wives and children. Most of them have higher education or an officer's commission earned in their youth. Some of them are rightfully disturbed at the discussion taking place. Others are furious, not over the looming genocide, but rather how it will affect their state business. And some are simply indifferently callous, as though they are simply hiring an exterminator for a rat problem. Indeed, that is how the senior SS men see it. But what makes this all so effective is the way the director chose to shoot these scenes. Director Frank Pearson, himself a veteran of World War II, and later one of the lead writers on Mad Men before his death in 2012, he came from the older school of filmmaking, and he had obviously taken inspiration from what many describe as the perfect movie. 12 Angry Men, starring Henry Fonda. That film too takes place entirely in a boardroom and its surrounding environs, confined to one singular cast of characters from start to finish. Conspiracy was shot the same way. It was shot close up, with the participants conversing across the table, the camera flashing to and fro from each perspective in what appears to be single takes. How they managed this feat in such a confined space is wondrous. It's a historical building, they couldn't exactly knock holes in the wall. But it allows you to get right in the actors' faces, making use of the high-caliber Shakespearean performers to the fullest extent possible. Every raised eyebrow, every eye roll or furtive exchange of glances, all of it is captured on film. Every twitch of consternation, every change in expression, all of it, captured in high definition for all to see. It almost feels like you, the audience, are seated at the same table. These men in front of you are not characters on film, they're real people, just as they were in life. And so the film goes on, more discussions are had, and you feel the tone slowly start to shift as they go even deeper down into the crux of the matter. The tone gets darker and darker. What the final solution will actually be. The method, the process. Castration, sterilization, enslavement, and ultimately, extermination. They discuss the method for each of these processes, productivity, locations of the facilities to be established, the efficiency projections of labor, and the process of extermination. And as they do this, they make comments, remarks, raise concerns, exchange ideas on what the best way of organizing it will be. Then, during the conversation about sterilization, they start thinking, it's pretty funny, isn't it? I mean, think about it. You're trying to get these people to voluntarily submit to castration. I mean, could you imagine the process for that? I mean, it's really funny. And then they start, cracking jokes about, whether you can get an injection or whether you use x-rays to do this. And they start going back and forth, and then you feel a laugh creeping up your throat. And there it is. The penny drops. You catch yourself before you laugh. Hell, I'm half Jewish. I'm the subject of this extermination. I'm the guy they want to kill. You stop and realize what they're discussing, what the implications of this conversation are, but by then, it's too late. Therein lies conspiracy's true nature. Its true horror. The strings they have been pulling this entire time. You aren't just watching this meeting. You are a member of it. In the abstract of the meeting setting, you've pushed to the back of your mind exactly what you were discussing, and you've probably even started feeling sympathy or identification with some of the men at the table. After all, during the meeting, they very consciously used euphemism to discuss what they're talking about. Evacuation, sterilization, relocation. It was all euphemisms. You've pushed it all to the back of your mind. And now, this is just a meeting. A meeting between people who are bantering and arguing and telling jokes. They've all got their own interests and ideas, and that's compelling. And if you, the viewer, has had any experience working in an office, you have been to a meeting exactly the same as this one. Sales figures, company updates, briefing on a new promotion or technology being rolled out by the company. You've met these men. These men are your co-workers. The staff you see running around in the background are the same as the cleaners who show up to clear the office as you leave your shift in the evening. We've all done this. All of us have worked through the mire of office politics. We've complained about head office. We've spread rumours about what we've heard's going on in other branches of the business or what gossip we've heard on the floor. We relay our own experiences with our jobs and what we've been up to, what we've been doing. These men are just like you. You're one of them. They're just like you. They're just like me. They aren't any different. And by extension, we are no different than them. What separates us is our circumstance and nothing more. While many of us have read Hannah Arendt's words on the banality of evil, watching this film makes you truly understand it. What's more, it makes you feel it. However, I would amend Lady Arendt's observation somewhat. I am of the opinion that true evil is not in the banal, but the indifferent. These men are, despite all their petty politics, arguments over power, and supposed ethical concerns, these men are Nazis, committed to the hate-filled and monstrous practices laid down in their political charters. And yet, while their hatred to those they deem inferior is apparent, it is not one of intended genocidal malice. They didn't go out of their way when all of this started to exterminate all the people they consider inferior. It's worse. The Jews and other undesirables, the Romani people, the LGBT community, all of them are simply an annoyance, a pest problem, vermin. The suffering they inflict is not banal, nor is it inherently vindictive, at least to the extent that you would consider it. This whole process is a pragmatic resolution to their problems. The millions of human beings who would board those trains are not people. They are units of production, a resource, and eventually refuse to be burned, numbered and catalogued in a database with famous German efficiency. For the men at this table, the evil is not their banality, it's their mundanity. It demonstrates that true evil is indifference. If I were to run a history class on the Holocaust, I would hold a special day where the class as a whole watches Conspiracy, followed by Schindler's List. The extrapolation from theory to reality. In fact, I have a scene to enunciate my point perfectly. As Amon Girth shoots the female engineer, it's preceded by this exchange.
My name is Diana Reiter. I'm a graduate of civil engineering from the University of Milan.
Oh, an educated Jew, like Karl Marx himself. Unterscharführer.
Jawohl.
Shoot her.
Herr Kommandant! I'm only trying to do my job.
Yeah, I'm doing mine.
It seems pretty straightforward. She is an intelligent and educated Jewish woman. Her job is as a construction engineer and she's seen a problem. But Amon Girth is different. He isn't an SS commandant or genocidal maniac. At least not to himself, or to anyone else there. It may be his rank, it may be his role, it may be what we understand him to be. But to him, and to the Nazi regime, his job is as a social engineer. He can't tolerate an educated Jew. They're a threat. We may rightly call it murder. We may rightly call it genocide, and it is both of those things, but to them, it wasn't. It was a job. A 9 to 5 with crap overtime. What Conspiracy does is shine a light on how easy it all is. How quickly the axe falls when there is no one watching who wields it. That is what makes this film so horrifying, so scary, so unnerving it sends chills down my spine every time I watch it. And despite all the scholarship, despite all we've seen and all we know, despite everything we've done since, the battle cry of never again seemingly rings hollow. As once again, less than a century later, a fascist war machine marches across Europe, obtaining living space for its colonists while leaving mass graves in its wake. And even as we speak right now, as this video goes to air, the victims of this horrific crime, the people who survived the genocidal horror inflicted at this conference, are at risk of committing the exact same crime as their tormentors out of fear. Because we around the world, in the developed nations, all of us are doing exactly the same now as we did then. When the Jews asked for help, we turned them away. When Ukraine asked for help, we only committed when it was our own asses at risk. And now, as the war between Israel and Palestine has boiled over once again, a war whose biggest underlying cause was our inaction on the very crime this video is about, the worst part of it is, then, as now, the death, the horror, the war, and eventually the genocide, none of it was caused by evil monsters with grand schemes. No. It was caused by the indifference of all of us. We looked on and said it wasn't our problem. And we kept saying it until it was far too late. And after that tragedy, after all that death and destruction, just as before, we said, well, it's too late now. There's nothing we can do. So it's not our problem. As the old saying goes, All it takes for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing. One day, we'll have to learn from our mistakes. But I don't know when that day will be. And despite all my skills at prose and the vast catalogue of literature I have at my disposal, I haven't really got an appropriate way to end this video. So, I will again leave you with a quote from an award-winning author, Alice Sebold, whose analysis is far more succinct than mine. Murderers are not monsters. They're men. And that is the most frightening thing about them.